Good evening. My name is Regina Gallardo. I'm a senior from Mexico City studying art history and Latin American studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Davis Museum virtual presentation by author Christina Thompson, organized in conjunction with the exhibition Lisa Rejana in Pursuit of Venus, Infected, on view through December 18th. Please note that the Davis will close on December 19th for renovations and will reopen in February 2024 with the career survey of Wellesley alumni artist Lorraine O'Grady, class of 1955. Lorraine O'Grady's both and. I hope you will visit this fall. We will begin with a native land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Davis Museum at Wellesley College is built on ancestral and traditional land of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize that the United States removal, termination, and assimilation policies and practices resulted in the forced settlement of indigenous land and the attempted erasure of indigenous cultures and languages. We further acknowledge the oppression, injustices, and discrimination that indigenous people have endured, and that there is much work to be done on the important journey of reconciliation. We commit to strengthen our understanding of the history and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples and to steward this land. We further recognize the many Indigenous people living here today, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations, who have rich ancestral histories in Wellesley and its surrounding communities. Today, their descendants reminds us that they're still here, where they maintain a vital and visible presence. We honor and respect the enduring relationship between these peoples and this land, as well as the strength of Indigenous culture and knowledge, the continued existence of tribal sovereignty, and the principle of tribal self-determination. To participate in this program, please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. We're using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions. Live captioning is provided through our Zoom webinar. You can turn it on and off with the closed captions button in the features bar, which is at your bottom of your screen. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Lisa Fishman, Ruth Gordon Shapiro Class of 1937, Director of the Davis Museum, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you so much to Regina for so ably introducing our event this evening, and to media specialist at the Davis, Serena Conreddy, for her work at the back end in organizing this webinar. Let me also reiterate a warm welcome to you all to visit this fall. A little bit of background on this evening's presentation. Maori artist Lisa Rejana's visually stunning and conceptually provocative digital panorama, In Pursuit of Venus Infected, is based on a fashionable early 19th century French scenic wallpaper, Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique, that capitalized on popular fascination with the voyages of Captain James Cook and other European explorers to the South Pacific. Rejana destabilizes the dominant historical narrative of encounter, centering Indigenous people as agents rather than subjects, privileging Native realities, experiences, and points of view. The critique embedded in the work is political, aesthetic, technological, and historical, rendered through a decolonial lens. The exhibition, which I curated, and this kind of related programming, this webinar and the other three that follow, are generously supported by the Mildred Cooper Glimcher 1961 Endowed Fund, the Davis Museum World Cultures Fund, the Davis Museum Endowed Fund for International Cultural Programs, and Wellesley College Friends of Art. This evening's program with Christina Thompson unpacks some of the important questions Rejana raises in her work. Our speaker, Christina Thompson, is the author of Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia, which won the 2020 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for nonfiction, and the 2019 New South Wales Premier General History Prize, and was a finalist for the 2020 Phi Beta Kappa Ralph Waldo Emerson Award, the 2019 Mountbatten Maritime Award, the 2019 Sigurd F. Olson Nature Writing Award, and the 2019 Queensland Literary Award. Her first book, Come on Shore and We Will Kill and Eat You All, was a finalist for the 2009 New South Wales Premier Literary Award and the 2010 William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. She is the recipient of fellowships from the NEA and the NEH, including a Public Scholar Award. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Vogue, American Scholar, and BBC World Histories. She teaches at the writing program at Harvard and in Harvard University Extension, and can be found at her website and on Twitter. Both links are in the chat. I want to thank Christina Thompson personally for her brilliant work. I read both of her books with great interest and enthusiasm and took away key input to my research in advance of the Rehana exhibition. Her work also pointed me to further resources that were equally critical. I find that she has an extraordinary capacity for storytelling, for weaving historical fact, autobiography, and speculative investigation into most readable, informative texts. You would do yourself a favor to pick up Sea People, which is here, and Come on Shore. My copies are terribly dog-eared from the number of times I've delved into them. You would do yourself a favor to pick a copy of each one of those. With that, I hope you will join me in welcoming Christina Thompson.
Well, that was a very lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I am really happy to have been invited to speak in conjunction with the Rehana exhibition, which is an amazing, amazing piece of work. And I would just encourage everybody who's in the Boston area to go and see it at the Davis Museum. It's quite remarkable, and this is your chance, frankly. When I was invited to give this talk in conjunction with the piece, the Rehana exhibition, I suggested that we might call it something like, how do we tell the story of what happened in the past? I was thinking about how so much of what is interesting about the Rehana exhibition, how much of what is innovative about it has to do with the way that the artist delivers a version of some very well-known events, the death of Cook, the transit of Venus, the discovery of Tahiti, and so on. To me, this innovation is in the execution, right? So it's the brilliant idea of using the French wallpaper. It's the fantastic technical execution of the piece, which involves using live action, actors against a painted backdrop, which is just amazing to look at. It's the subtle integration of, on the one hand, these very well-known and fairly well-documented historical events, and then this kind of quotidian incidents or scenes, rather. So, girls dancing and kind of teasing each other, and a couple of young men sort of messing around with a sextant and stuff like that. And then this very nuanced way in which the artist humanizes all the characters. Now, the underlying thesis of this work, which is that the islander point of view has been absent from these stories and absent from this history, was already pretty familiar to me. It's acknowledged in virtually all the histories of the Pacific for the last 30 or 40 years, and it is really front and center in histories from the last 10 or 20, which is not to say that it is not important. It is, in fact, for anyone telling stories about the Pacific, the crux of the matter. It's the thing that writers, historians, artists all have to wrestle with. But the reason the history of contact in the Pacific is so one-sided is not just political. It's not just because the voices of those in power drown out the voices of everybody else. This is true. This is certainly true. But there's this other purely practical reason, which is that while there are lots of sources documenting the European experience of the Pacific, of contact in the Pacific, there are not very many that document the islander point of view. One of these cultures left a vast documentary record, and the other left basically what you might call traces. Some documents, a few fascinating documents, some transcriptions, some hearsay, an echo, So when I think about these stories, how to tell these stories, what always happens to me is that I come face to face with this question: how do we know what happened? I am going to share my screen now, so you'll have something fun to look at other than just me. And let's just make sure this is all going along fine. I hope that's fine. Someone will let me know if it isn't. So several years ago, I decided to try and tell a story about the history of the Pacific for which there is almost no direct evidence. I wanted to tell the story, the deep history of the Hawaiians, the Tahitians, the Maori, the other islanders of the mid-Pacific who live in this shaded triangle here, which is the Polynesian Triangle. I wanted to talk about how they were the first people to reach this remote region of the world, how in the course of several thousand of years, they found and colonized every habitable island in this, what is a 10 million square mile area, and how until the modern era, they represented the largest geographically speaking, the largest single cultural area in the world. Telling this story ended up being an exercise in assembling a whole lot of kind of fragmentary and contradictory and partial and very biased source material. And what I thought I would do tonight is I thought I might just share a couple of these sources with you. Especially, these are things that sort of cross my path, especially things that give us some insight into the islander perspective. So I need to give you a little background. The deep history of the Polynesian people begins about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago roughly in Taiwan. A people we know as Austronesians, these are the ancestors of the Polynesian people, began making these voyages. They began moving down southward through the Philippines into island Southeast Asia. A branch of these people went west, as you can see that arrow, went west across the Indian Ocean and ended up in Madagascar, which was an amazing journey. And the other branch went out through Indonesia, out over Papua New Guinea, and into the New Caledonia, Vanuatu area, into Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, the Society Islands, that's Tahiti. And then they made ultimately these really long legs, these long voyages out to the far points of the Polynesian Triangle, New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Hawaii in the north, and Rapa Nui, Easter Island. So they traveled in these large double-hulled voyaging canoes. This is a painting by Herb Kane, who made a lot of paintings of pre-contact Hawaii. They might have had as many as 40 or 50 people. They were carrying with them all the things they needed to settle in a new place. They carried animals, pigs, dogs, rats, chickens. They carried plants, coconut, breadfruit, sweet potato taro. They had tools of bone and shell and stone, but no metal. They stitched their canoes together with senet. And they did not use any kinds of maps or charts or documents of any kind. In fact, they did not have writing. Everything they knew about the world around them and their place in it was transmitted orally, and they retained it in their heads. So the longest and most extraordinary of these voyages occurred about 1,000 years ago. These are the ones out from the sort of center of the triangle. And by 12,000 AD, they had reached New Zealand, which is the last group of islands to be settled. Then, for reasons that remain obscure, but that might have to do with the closing of a voyaging climate window, well, it's not at all clear, but it's an interesting idea, these great migrations stopped. And so when Europeans arrived in the Pacific, this is the next group of explorers to reach this part of the world in the 16th and then 17th and 18th centuries, they found the islands of the mid-Pacific occupied by these very distinct but closely related groups, whom we today know as Hawaiians, Maori, Tahitian, Marquesan, and Samoa and Tongan, and that's like that. Now, it was not immediately clear to these Europeans who these people were, where they had come from, and how they had gotten there, how they had reached this part of the world. There were a number of theories. Some people thought they had come from South America. Some people thought they were Malay. Some people thought they had come from a continent that had yet to be discovered, a missing continent that people were looking for, but had never found. Some people thought they were descended from a tribe of wandering Jews. And some people suggested that they had been created in the islands by God. So there were quite a lot of theories. And the answer, what we sort of believe today, which was that their ancestors could be traced to this island off the coast of Asia, which I told you about, really only emerged over a couple of centuries and involved contributions from a number of different disciplines, molecular biology being the most recent one, but also archaeology, linguistics, and so on and so forth. But one piece of the puzzle was obviously what the islanders had to say about their own history and their own, origin stories. This is a slide from, this is a grab from the Rehana installation. The single most interesting source on this subject was a man named Tupaya. And I think that the man on the right is Tupaya in this picture, but I don't exactly know. I'm just kind of guessing. And I think that he's seen here talking to either Joseph Banks or Sidney Parkinson from Cook's first voyage. Now, Tupaya was a priest. We call him a priest. I will talk a little bit more later about what he actually was, from the island of Raiatea in the Leeward Society Islands in what is now French Polynesia. He was about 40 years old, and he was living in exile in Tahiti when Cook arrived in 1769 on the Endeavour to observe the transit of Venus. Now, most of the encounters that take place in this period, in the 16th, in the 17th, and into the 18th century, most of the encounters that take place between islanders and outsiders during what we might call the long kind of European exploration period were very short. They lasted a matter of weeks, mostly a matter of days, but sometimes weeks. And Cook's voyage, this first voyage, was really different. It was really different because Cook was there in Tahiti for 4 months, which at the time was really an eternity. It was certainly long enough for some language to be learned in both directions, and for some information, some real information to be exchanged. This image, for example, is a sketch by the artist Sidney Parkinson, who was with Cook, of a Tahitian religious practice. That platform is a place on which offerings would be put to the gods after someone's death. And Cook and Banks and Parkinson and others on this expedition all managed to document quite a lot of details about Tahitian customs and knowledge, and a lot of what they learned came from Tupaya. So Tupaya was also very interested in the Europeans. He spent a lot of time with Cook and Banks, providing them with lists of islands, sailing information about weather, about winds, all of which were really of great interest to the navigator Cook. But Tupaya also seems to have spent some time with Sidney Parkinson, the artist, because he made a series of drawings in which he must have been using Parkinson's materials. And he also seemingly was extrapolating from Parkinson's technique. This is a drawing, for example, of a beach in Tahiti showing a particular kind of a house and a number of different plants. I think it's got pandanus, breadfruit, banana, coconut, and taro, and then specific kinds of vessels, sailing vessel and war canoes. So it has this kind of interesting, closely observed quality. The amazing fact about Tupaya's drawings is this, though. It was not until 1997 that anybody realized that Tupaya was the artist. For nearly 200 years, it was thought that basically nobody knew who the artist was. The artist wasn't known. It was thought that maybe Joseph Banks was the artist because the drawings were found in his papers, and the artist was also sometimes, that seems sort of implausible, but the artist was also sometimes known as the artist of the chief mourner, because of this figure on the right here, which is the chief mourner, which is a ritual figure in a religious figure in Tahiti. So that was what he was known as for a long time. And then in 1997, kind of out of the blue, this letter from Joseph Banks surfaced, in which Banks refers to this image of, on the right, Banks himself exchanging a piece of like linen or something, possibly a linen handkerchief, for a crayfish with a Maori in New Zealand. And Banks makes it clear that Tupaia was the artist. And so that really was kind of an amazing moment, I think, for people to suddenly know that they were seeing the work of Tupaia himself, the handiwork of Tupaia himself. It's kind of interesting, I think, to think about what we see when we look at these images. Tupaia's official role in Tahiti was that of tahua, which is one version of a word in Maori. It would be tohunga. It's translated as priest, but it means really something more like expert, master, authority, something like that. So Tupaia's areas of expertise were quite numerous. He would probably, if we were to divvy them up in the way that we do today, they might include cosmology, genealogy, history, medicine, geography, astronomy, meteorology, navigation, religion overall, as if that were separated, which it really wasn't in those days in Tahiti. And really, the thing that I think all the reports about him stress is the superiority of his intellect. He was described repeatedly as a man of really commanding intellectual power. That one of the writers wrote, he was reputed by the people themselves to have been one of the cleverest men in the islands. Now, when we look at these drawings, I think what we see is that they have sort of a naive quality. But what you have to remember is that Polynesia was famous for its art, but it was a decorative pattern-based art. What you're seeing here is tapa on the left, a leg tattoo pattern from the Marquesas in the center. On the right, a Maori carving from New Zealand. And so, while there was stylized representation of figures, animals, various kinds of things, there was no tradition of naturalistic illustration. So Tupaia's paintings, which are realistic and closely observed, even really ethnographic, are this kind of radical in the context. And what that sort of says to me is it kind of confirms what other people were saying about him, which was that he was a man of really boundless curiosity. Now, one of the things that we unfortunately do not have, something that does not exist in the documentary record, is a portrait of Tupaia. So what I'm showing you here is two portraits of a man named Mai. On the left, a painting by William Perry showing Mai, who was also, I think he was actually also from Raiatea, but he met the Europeans in Tahiti, like Tupaia. This is on the left, he's with Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, and on the right is this amazing, very famous portrait of Mai made in 1776 by Joshua Reynolds. Mai was a lot younger than Tupaia. He was about half his age. He was a person of much less authority in his own culture, but he did travel all the way to England and back without dying, which was quite an accomplishment in those days. So when Cook had finished observing the transit of Venus, he left Tahiti and he set out to do some exploring. And Tupaia, rather unexpectedly, volunteered to go with him. So the first place they went to the Leeward Islands, which were Tupaya's home islands. And this was a place that Tupaya knew intimately. And there's some very interesting descriptions of him praying to the winds for a wind on the voyage there, and then navigating a pass in between in the reef to get into the island, and performing his knowledge and skill as a navigator. But he also shared his knowledge in this other way. This is a chart that Tupaya drew for Cook and Banks, showing all the passes and harbors and headlands and other features of Raiatea and Taha'a and Bora Bora and Maupiti. The place names, which you can't really see, but they're those little sort of scratchy things around the islands. These are in Banks's handwriting. And so, because of course Tupaya didn't write, right? He didn't, but he was also not in the habit of making maps, right? Because Tupaya's geographical knowledge would have taken the form of chant. It was oral. So again, a map like this represents a translation of a body of oral knowledge, an extensive body of knowledge, geographical knowledge, into into a Cartesian cartographic form, which, again, if you think about it, is kind of an amazing thing to have done. But the really amazing one is this one. This is Tupaya's chart of the Society Islands. This is one of the kind of great objects of Pacific history. It was drawn by Tupaya in 1769 on board the Endeavour as the ship sailed from the Society Islands to New Zealand. It was drawn in the great cabin of the ship with Cook right there, presumably. The original is lost. This is the copy, a copy that was made by Cook and presumably annotated under Tupaya's direction. It's a really complicated document, both because it's made under these very curious conditions of collaboration between two people who don't totally understand one another, and also because it represents what was certainly to Cook and is still to us today an unfamiliar way of looking at the world. So part of it has been a matter of trying to decode it. The chart covers a really large area, encompassing much more than just the Society Islands, but the Marquesas, the Australs, the Tuamotu, some of the islands in the Tonga Samoa area, which are very far to the west. It does not extend to the far reaches of the Polynesian Triangle, to New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Hawaii, or Rapa Nui. Although there are people who have tried to claim that it does, I don't think it does. But there's a lot of mystery here. Some parts of it correspond quite well to modern geographic understanding. Some parts of it do not. Many of the names are identifiable, but some remain quite mysterious. Now, various attempts have been made to explain what's going on here. And I'm not going to get into the really nitty-gritty, but I would just tell you a couple of things. One of the ideas is that some of the elements are not so much geographical, they're sort of extra geographical, they're kind of mythic or cosmological, which might explain why they don't seem to correspond to real islands. There's also then this really interesting idea about how maybe what is being represented is a kind of, rather than a set of locations, it's a mosaic of sailing directions, that what this is that it's not so much a description of where places are as it is how you get to them. And that it would thereby represent a navigator's point of view rather than a cartographer. So I don't know, there's several books about this. if you want, I can tell you what they are if you want to follow up. Either way, what a document like Tupaya's chart represents is, or what it opens up, is the way that the world looked to Tahitians in the days before contact with Europeans. It presents an islander point of view at a time when Europeans and Pacific Islanders still were very divergent, and there had been almost no cross-pollination, no convergence, very little exchange. However, as we get into the early 19th century, that changes. This is actually even at the very end of the 18th here. This is a painting of the cessation of the Matavai district in Tahiti to Captain James Wilson of the Duff, which was the ship that brought the first missionaries to Polynesia. Now, the 19th century is the century of colonization in the Pacific. It is the century in which, I am fond of saying, everything changes. On the one hand, Europeans and islanders are much more able to communicate with one another, and you see that pretty quickly in the early 19th century, but they also begin to influence each other, and as we know, that influence goes very much more one way than the other. Now, many more missionaries were going to come to Tahiti and Tonga and the Marquesas and Mangaia, New Zealand, and everywhere over the next few decades. And after a slow start, they gained a lot of converts and became extremely influential in many of the islands. I think this is an engraving, an illustration of the Reverend William Alexander preaching in Hawaii on the island of Kauai. This is about 1840. Now, most of these missionaries were Protestants. There were Catholics, but I'm going to talk mainly about the Protestants. They were Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists for the most part. They came from England and America. They were mostly Calvinist in their leanings. They abhorred idleness and sloth. They mistrusted amusements, the idea of amusements. They feared uncontrolled sexuality. They were abolitionists and anti-slavery crusaders. And they also saw themselves quite clearly as protectors of the islanders in the face of the evil influence of other Europeans, particularly Europeans of a commercial bent, whalers, traders, and in some cases also governmental people with annexation aims. They were mostly lower and middle working class, but a few of them were educated. And some of those who were educated took a really keen interest in Polynesian languages and culture. So, you know, while we think of missionaries as having uprooted and destroyed much of the indigenous culture of the islands, it is also true that some of them are responsible for the preservation of quite a lot of arcane information, of esoterica. So, irony. This is, speaking of arcane, the focus of many of the early missionaries was religion. Duh, right? They were religious people, they were interested in religion, but they were really interested in Polynesian religion. And so one of the things they made a big point of doing was collecting creation chants, which is a wonderful thing because we have pretty good documentation of quite an extensive range of chants from many different islands. These are, you know, stories of the origin of the world, the emergence of beings, the relationship between gods and humans and creatures and plants and rocks and so on. And, you know, within the context of Polynesian culture, they are really important because they are this foundation for the genealogies, which are then, mixing my metaphors a little bit, but the spine of Polynesian history, the backbone of Polynesian history. So this image is an illustration of a creation chant. It depicts the little round circle at the bottom. Underneath it is the beginning in deep darkness. This is represented by this little circle of small dots. And above that is a primordial pair. So there's a male Titumu, which is represented as this thing that looks a little like a snake or a dinosaur. And then the female Te Papa, which is sort of this thick black line right there. And then above them rise generation upon generation of plants and animals and gods and humans and activity of various kinds. It was said to have been made, the drawing was said to have been made in 1869 by a Tuhunga priest named Paiore from the island of Ana in the Tuamotus. And according to one story, Paiore drew a picture in the sand with a stick, and it was copied by a relative. Another source says that Paiore was literate and that he knew how to draw this himself and annotate it. But in any case, here we go again, we only know it from a photograph taken in 1892 because the original is lost. That's the way it is with so many of these things. Now, another thing, in addition to creation chants, sort of relatedly, another thing that Protestant missionaries cared a great deal about was literacy. And this is because for them, salvation could really only come through a kind of direct and personal connection to God, and the pathway to that connection, and therefore to a state of grace, could not be reached through, or this state of grace could not be reached simply by attending church or listening to your minister and things like that. It had to come via the word of God itself. It had to come via the Bible. And so people had to be taught to read so they could read the Bible. So reading and writing literacy was absolutely foundational for evangelical Protestants, missionaries. And one of the first things they did when everywhere they went was to set up schools. And this is a copybook belonging to a Maori student named Rangi Tawhito, who was among the boys educated at a mission station in Te Puna in the Bay of Islands. It dates, as you can see, to 1826, which is just 12 years after the first mission was established in New Zealand. And its author would have been among, I think, would have been among the first generation of Maori to become fully literate, probably both in English and in Maori. Now, this emphasis on reading and writing had lots of interesting consequences, one of which was the very predictable one that it gave rise to a number of Indigenous scholars who would write their own history. And in Hawaii, there was a very successful push for literacy among the ali'i, or the chiefly class. And men like, mostly men, most of the main scholars are men. There were some chiefly women who were very influential and important in this period, but the scholars ended up being these guys who were at the seminary. People like Davide Malo and Samuel Kamakau. Malo was born in 1795, and he grew up in the traditional court of King Kamehameha I. And when he died, he ended his life as an ordained minister and one of the great historians of the pre-colonial Hawaii. Kamakau was also, who was a half generation younger, he was also a statesman and a historian, and he was one of the founders of the Hawaiian Historical Society. Now, accounts by these mission-trained Indigenous historians are very interesting. They are different from the accounts by 19th century Europeans, obviously, but their writing is also complex. Malo, for example, had personal knowledge of what you might call the old ways, but he was already living in a different world. And his own ideas and understanding of what was going on and what had happened, in fact, differed from those of his forebears somewhat already. So part of what we learn when we look at this work is we learn about this transitional generation. We learn about the past, we learn about the Polynesian, the sort of Polynesian, the Hawaiian in this case, point of view, but we also we're really learning about this transitional moment and how one kind of set of ideas merges into another. And the point for me about this is that, these kinds of sources are really layered and they're really complex. And sometimes what happens to me, this is kind of like that thing about how if you know too much about something you read in the newspaper, you go, oh, well, this is what happens to me is that when I see, sometimes I see these sources being used in a way that makes me sort of not super happy. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm not unhappy about it. I just noticed something about it. So about a year ago, there was a series of articles in the New York Times and the Guardian, the Smithsonian, a lot of other places, asserting that Maori voyagers may have been the first people to reach Antarctica. And this is the Guardian headline. The Guardian, oral history suggests that Polynesian explorer Hui Te Rangiora traveled to the region in the 7th century. And the Smithsonian headline was kind of similar. It said, Maori may have reached Antarctica 1,000 years before Europeans. New research draws on oral histories and other traditional records often ignored by Europeans. Now, the thing is that I know when I read these, I knew what the sources were. I knew what this source was that they were using. The evidence for this claim comes from a written account of traditions that were dictated by a Rarotongan scholar in probably maybe the 1860s or 70s, named Te Ariki Taraare. His account was given to a New Zealand, late 19th century New Zealand surveyor and amateur ethnologist by the name of S. Percy Smith, who Smith then translated and annotated these accounts, these traditions, and published them in a journal of which he was the editor, and then in a book in 1898 and 99. And it's Smith who in his commentary suggests that some of Te Ariki's remarks can be interpreted to mean that Polynesian voyaging had extended to the Antarctic. Now, my reading of Smith's work, I've read a lot of Smith's work, and my reading of it, Smith had a lot of theories about origins of Polynesians and their voyaging history. And my reading of his work gives me some sense of caution about claims that he made. Now, it's the same kind of caution I would bring to any material of this period. But the thing is that Smith was a romantic, and he was a booster of the idea of Polynesian voyaging. He was a scholar, but not exactly in the way we would describe that today. He cut and pasted, he rearranged, he translated, he interpreted, he transformed a lot of the oral testimony that he got his hands on in ways that are very well documented now. And he put his spin on the material in a pretty big way. So this is not surprising. This is true of all these sources. The missionaries, when they compiled their creation myths, left out all the sex, of which there is quite a bit, because that made them uncomfortable. And Smith just had a different agenda. His goal was to tell a heroic story of Polynesian voyaging from the ancient homeland of Hawaii through the vast Pacific Ocean to Aotearoa. And it suited him to turn Te Ariki's remarks into evidence that Maori had sailed below the Antarctic Circle. Now, far be it from me to say that they did not. I love the idea that they did that might have happened, and I think it's possible. I am also a huge booster of Polynesian voyaging, so anybody who reads me should bear that in mind. I wrote a whole book in celebration of it, but I think that Smith's claim for this assertion is weak, actually. And I think that there was it just struck me that there was a certain irony in the claim that this was an example of how traditional knowledge had been ignored by Europeans, when in fact, it is an example of how traditional knowledge was collected and probably adulterated by Europeans in the colonial period. So there's a much bigger backstory here. Of course, this is always the way it is. I mean, I'm not complaining. I'm just bringing it to your attention because I can. A lot of creative work originates in the feeling that something is missing, that a story has gone untold, that needs to be told, that the conventional take on events is not adequate in some way. This is the impetus behind Lisa Rehana's work. It's the desire to round out the existing versions of contact history, to add back missing elements and missing points of view. And to me, what's kind of interesting is thinking about, how do we do that? What are our options? Because one thing we can do is we can bring our imagination to bear. We can imagine our way into the gaps. This is what people do when they write novels and they create art. And it's incredibly successful in Lisa Rehana's installation. That's probably the best I've ever seen, I would have to say, of this material. But it doesn't always work. I recently reread James Michener's Hawaii, which is published in 1959, and I was really struck by the feeling that his pre-contact Hawaiians are basically mid-20th century Americans in fancy dress. I think anybody who read it would feel that way today. there's a lot, I believe, still to be learned, even from the biased and incomplete sources that we have. We wish there were more. We wish there were more maps like Tupaia's, more sketches like Paiore's, more histories like David Amala's. But, even in the works of Percy Smith and other, people like that, Joseph Banks, there's evidence of other angles of vision, other perspectives, other points of view. And the work we have to do is really in looking at who said what and then why, thinking about their limitations, and kind of banging these sources up against one another in the hope that, in the end, we will arrive at a fairer, fuller, more complex, and ultimately more interesting version of the story. And that's it for me. So.
Thank you so much. Very excellent. I have so many questions. I wonder, Regina's inviting people to put questions into the chat, which would be terrific. What you're describing, the historical record, I mean, it's very easy for me to trace what you're describing to the problems that challenge museums, the kinds of storytelling we tell, about objects, the storytelling that we do around objects that have historical gaps. And the work that you're doing, the work that Lisa's doing, I think reminds us not only to ask about the stories that exist, the kind of canonical take, let's say, those narratives, but reminds us, this is why I thought it was so important for students to see this work and to hear you speak, but reminds us that things are wobbly. Things are, they are not what they appear. They are not linear. And when you're describing, working with fragments and trying to elucidate what's almost impossible to pin down fully, and the way that imagination features into that, that is not what students are taught, certainly, about how to write history or how to study history, right? Mm. Do you find that your approach violates some of what you were taught yourself?
I never got taught how to do this. I sometimes think to myself, I'm clearly reinventing a wheel here. I mean, that there's just not, but I think maybe some of my excitement about it is because I'm sort of an autodidact in a little bit in this area. Yeah. So I kind of discover things and then I think, oh, that's amazing. So I have a lot of energy and enthusiasm for it. I think partly because I didn't get told what to think. I learned, I figured it out. But I think, one of the things that I think people should be careful of, and I think what I'm seeing a lot of now, I mean, there's this kind of joke, of course, nobody will have picked up, but there's a little joke in the very end of Sea People, where I talk about how, the oral traditions, now they were dismissed for a long time in the 20th century, but then they kind of came into vogue as people began to try to recuperate, to try to recover the indigenous perspective. Everyone went, well, here's a bunch of stuff they told us about themselves, so let's look at that. And then it turned out that was complicated. So good, but complicated. But the joke was just that every paper on, X-ray fluorescence of lithic artifacts, like even the scientific papers will now reference some oral tradition as a kind of evidence to support whatever the finding of the scientist is. And my feeling about that is that on the one hand, I love the fact that this material has become important. And on the other hand, I think, I wouldn't be pretending to, I mean, I think that the people who are doing that are doing it naively, You know, they're doing it without really recognizing. And I think this is the Percy Smith story, is that, you know, that's a really complicated little piece of data. And it's being bandied about as if it were something that it's not.
Yeah, that's
maybe who cares, you know, maybe who cares, but also it's kind of interesting to know that there's a backstory on those little things, to me anyway.
So this process of translation, right? Because there is all of this translation from something that someone's passing along by telling it to another, to a drawing that maps it, or to a story that someone writes down, whether that's, I think in that instance, right, the idea that someone dictated just seems impossible to me, right? Because someone's saying, the other person is using his own language, right?
Sometimes they wrote it down in the original languages. There's quite a lot of documentation in original languages, because the people who did a lot of this work, the thing about the fact that it was missionaries is that missionaries had a big commitment. They committed themselves. They committed their whole lives to this project. And so they would go out to an island and then they would live there for the rest of their life. And they often became very good, very fluent. And so there is pretty great, in some islands and not others, good transcription in the original language. It's also kind of hard. I don't read it. I don't read Tahitian, but you know, the accounts are interesting because sometimes it's old Tahitian and it doesn't map all that well onto modern Tahitian. So there are a lot of layers. In fact, there's a book of very classic work called Ancient Tahiti, which was originally based on the collection of one of the earliest missionaries in Tahiti, and then assembled and put together by his granddaughter in Hawaii many years later, almost a century later. And I always feel like every time I get into an academic environment like this, I'm like, is there a graduate student out there who would be interested in a project? Because this thing is due for a scholarly edition, which really digs into all the problems. So yeah, and but you're right. Dictation, there are some amazing stories of people sitting there saying, it was exhausting. You know, I was he was talking and I made him repeat it over and over and over again. And he was very angry because he didn't want to repeat it so many times. And so, yeah, it's a messy, messy process.
Definitely. Fascinating. We have a question here.
Yes.
Sorry, Regina, would you like to read it? Go ahead.
Yes, of course. So beyond the missionaries, were there other ethnographers whom you could cite who did work in the Pacific?
Other ethnographers? Yes. So there are several classes of people who are sources. There are, the earliest are the explorers. So mostly Royal Navy, official government expeditions usually. Then there are missionaries who go out and settle there. And then there is a whole cluster of sort of colonial officials. So for example, the governor of New Zealand, Sir George Grey, was a great collector and so one of the earliest really compendia of Maori myths or, traditions or whatever, was made by Sir George Grey. So, and another person in Hawaii was Abraham Fornander, who was a judge. And it's quite interesting because, of course, a lot of these colonial, they aren't exactly secular, but they're not missionaries. And there was a lot of tension between the missionaries and the government officials because missionaries didn't like anybody else. Then later, you have a whole, the Pacific was one of the great, laboratories, as it were, of early anthropology, especially American and British. So social anthropologists flocked to the Pacific. A lot of them were in the Western Pacific, in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and those areas, but they also, because Polynesia is this kind of interesting, it's this interesting sort of coherent region, it's possible to make a lot of interesting comparison between the different cultures, which are close but different, So it was a fertile ground for anthropologists. So there are a lot of anthropologists. And one of the ones that I would recommend having a look at is especially a guy who was the director of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. And his name was Te Rangi Hiroa. I can put it in the chat. He also known as Peter Buck, Sir Peter Buck, and he was half Maori and half Anglo-Irish or something. And he is a fascinating guy. Another project that needs doing, he should have a better biography. So if there's somebody out there who wants to do it, I thought about doing it years ago and I realized I wasn't the right person to do it, but he needs a good biography. So, and then there are quite a lot of other ones. And then if you want a modern person, if you want a contemporary person, you cannot do better than Patrick Kirch, Kirch. He is, I used to call him Mr. Pacific Archaeology. He's a wonderful writer, which not all of them are. But he wrote a book called On the Road of the Winds, which is a survey of archaeology in both Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and it's really fantastic and has incredible footnotes. So you will find everything you ever wanted to know.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a question about the term Polynesia. So when I met Lisa Rehana in Sydney, she asked me, do you have things in your collection from around here? And I said, well, we have some Polynesian and oceanic things. And she said, Polynesian? And then she looked at me and started to laugh. Later, I started to read the book that you recommended to me about Hawaii. And it seems like the term itself is very complicated. Can you speak to that a little bit?
It is very complicated. I think about it a lot, whether I want to use it or don't want to use it. And I do choose to use it sometimes because it is useful when we're talking about history, especially the history of, for example, anthropology. I also think that there is not a particularly good term for everybody. I mean, you can say Mauhi, which would be the Tahitian version. You could say Maori, which is the R, which is the New Zealand version. You can say Maoli. You can say Tangata Whenua. You can say you can say a bunch of different things. They tend to all mean slightly different things, and they are all in different languages. So there is no pan word. So I know that it sounds old, and I know that it sounds colonial, and I know that there are people who don't like it. And I'm not trying to offend anybody by using it.
Oh, no, I wasn't suggesting that.
No, but I get it. I just sometimes feel that, and I felt that in, when I was writing the book, that I was talking about this big, thing, this big history, this big geography, and this long history. And even using a term like Austronesian, which is just a linguistic term. If we tell you about the ancestors of the Polynesians are Austronesians, we just don't have any name for them because they don't have any name for it. Nobody has any name for them. I mean, that's the thing. And that term comes from linguistics because it's the designation of a language family. So it's a kind of a back formation in a weird way. You find all these languages, you say, oh, these languages are all connected. Let's call them Austronesian. Oh, the people who first brought them into this region, let's call them Austronesian. So, these terms are tricky. And I don't know what to do about it.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But I can see that people, there are certain circles in which people would just think it was, clueless, basically.
I wondered.
Yeah.
Tell me, you mentioned that it was a different experience for you to see Lisa's work in person versus being able to see clips online. And I wonder if you could speak to the immersion, the experience of being in the gallery and watching that piece.
Yeah, I thought it was just marvelous. I knew about what was in it. I knew what it looked like. I had seen a lot of stuff online about it, but I'd never seen it in person. And it's big, and the gallery is dark, and there are comfy chairs the way you've done it, which is excellent. And it is immersive. You get in and you start watching. And I think the main thing is because it's very, very big and it has action here, something in the background, action here, things unfolding at the full length of this however long it is, you would know. There's more there's more to look at than you can actually look at. And it scrolls by you at a lovely pace, just a nice pace. And then there's sound and stuff, and the sound of the different images that are coming and going and in and out. And so it's a lot to take in. And you know, when you're watching it, that you are not seeing it all. You just know that you're only catching 20% of it or 25% of it or something. And you just want to see it again. And also, I just think that, I mean, what I was saying about the way that on the one hand, it's very, she humanizes the characters in a really nice way. I sort of, there's a young British sentry or something who stands outside a tent, and he just looks so bored.
Yeah.
Bored and hot. And, and it's just kind of sweet. He's just this young kid who's got this stupid job, and there he is. With the young men who are putting the waistcoat on and taking it off and putting it on their legs and, joking around and stuff. I just thought all of it was so, and it has some of the more tense issues in there as well. Some issues of, of sexual abuse or of like violence or those things. They're there. It's not that they're not there, but they're not the only thing there, I guess, is the main thing. So I felt like it was really rich and kind of warm in a weird way, but also intelligent. So yeah, I can't say enough about what a great experience it was to see. And I'm of course going back to see it again and again. Sure. I'm taking everybody I know.
I'm glad to hear that. Well, I mean, that she would find warmth and compassion for historical figures, right, out of a consideration and a deep research into the complexity of encounter seems super unusual to me. This could be an entirely different work.
It could, and I think that there is a lot of anger in the Pacific towards the whole kind of colonial project. And it is particularly hot in places like New Zealand and Hawaii, which have been more heavily colonized. It is less, you find it much less in some other parts of the other islands. So it's, New Zealand is not, and Hawaii are not exactly representative. There are, independence movements in French Polynesia. Absolutely. I remember, being in the Marquesas with a woman who was going on and telling me how much she hated the French. And, you get that everywhere you go. Tonga, for example, is its independent kingdom. Samoa's situation is complicated because it has this relationship with the United States. So there are a lot of different, it's not really, it's not just one thing. I think one of the things that a lot of people who come at this material and this story and this part of the world from the point of view of post-colonialism and decolonization and the emergence, particularly of a kind of focus on indigeneity. One of the things that people sometimes don't accept is how strongly religious and how Christian much of the Pacific is. The islands are, many of the islands, people are very, very religious, and they are very religious in ways that, are considered kind of, there are people in some parts of the Pacific who think that they've all just drunk the Kool-Aid, and that's basically what the story is. And then you go there and they're like, this is what we believe, this is what we like. And there is a lot of indigenous Christianity all right through the Pacific, in the Western Pacific and all over the place. And that's something that I think is really often missed because it's not so strong in the places where the scholarship is coming from, which is like New Zealand, Hawaii, Australia. It's not as prominent. It's not as integrated into the kind of into the sort of power structures, the indigenous, the local power structures, the way it is in the islands. So it's again, it's a complicated big place with a lot of different stuff going on. So I think that you could tell a lot of different stories in a way. You know, I mean, there are places where you can go and you could say missionary and people will go, yes. And there are places where you can go say missionary and they'll go, yes, bad, you know, like terrible. I mean, people have really different feelings about it.
Do you see resonance in your studies in the Pacific? Do you see resonance with the impact of missionization there and in North America, let's say? I mean, there's been a lot of publicity lately about missionary schools and so on. And their very, very devastating impact on Native American and First Nations communities.
Yes, there are definitely things like that. And there are also, you know, there are a lot of people who have grown up in some of these quite severe churches who are very unhappy about it and very unhappy with them, in the same way that, I mean, I have a friend, for example, who, you know, was raised as a Mormon in Utah and has had a very complicated relation with the Mormon church. The Mormon church is very big in the Pacific. And I have recently had dinner with a Tongan guy that I liked a lot, who told me that he had a very complicated relationship with the Mormon church. And so I think that, yes, there are a lot of people who have mixed feelings about it. What's the way they do in the United States. And I don't know. I think, you know, in Australia is a little different. Certainly the whole history of the stolen generation and the missionization of Aborigines and Aboriginal people in Australia is a little different and probably a little closer to what happened in the United States and Canada in some ways.
Still very much living memory, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I think the same way it is in the United States and Canada, it's well within the reach of, and I don't really have that story. There are some stories, there's some interesting stories about some very old ones, actually, about a kind of a mission school in Tahiti with a big scandal about the relationship of the teacher to the girls. And that was a 19th century scandal.
Wow.
So yeah, that was something that was already being talked about in the mid 19th century, and it was hushed up, but it was also, you know, you can find evidence of it. So yeah, that stuff is always going on, and it's out there.
Oh, Regina.
Sorry. We have another question in the chat, which states, Christian missionary work is still happening in the Pacific Islander cultures today. Having never been there myself, I am curious, how is it received in the culture today? I am referencing the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons.
Tell me again what you mean. What about the Church of the Latter-day Saints? How is it received?
How is it received? Yes.
So I'll tell you an interesting story that another guy I know, Tongan, also from Utah, also a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, told me, which I thought was a story very interesting to me. He is not a person who has a complicated, I mean, he's a very committed member of the church, older guy. And I was getting a sort of history lesson from him about Tongan history. And I wanted to understand this question about the church and its role in the society. And he said to me, you know, in such and such a year, I don't know what it was, the 80s or something, he said a typhoon came, a huge storm came and hit Tongatapu and just wiped it out. Massive storm. They got hit by it. And he said, the only people who were able to help the population was the church, was the Mormon church. And it had water and it had shelter and it had food and it was ready and it helped the people. And he said, the government didn't help us. The king didn't help us. Nobody helped us. The church helped us. And I thought that was a really interesting story because I thought, you know, that would be meaningful to you if you could remember that. And so I think that there are places where people, you know, there are a lot of churches. Like Tonga is an interesting place in that respect. There are lots and lots of people. I think probably have like 98% church membership in the country. Very, very, very high. And there are a bunch of different churches. It's not just the Latter-day Saints. There are also Anglican churches. There are Wesleyans, Methodists. There are Assembly of God. There are Catholics. All different denominations. And in a lot of ways, this is sort of, I mean, I still have a lot to learn about this. This is an area that I am just starting to understand, but it's mapped onto the cultural hierarchies, the existing structures in a way that seems very, it feels, I don't want to say traditional exactly, but you know what I mean? It feels like it's got kind of historical coherence. There are aspects of these modern religions that made sense to people. They were alien, but not totally alien. And some aspects of them were really obviously unhelpful. And some aspects of them were sort of interestingly mapped pretty well. So but you wouldn't find that in, you know, in a country like New Zealand, for example, which is much bigger and much more multicultural and much more and much more heavily colonized and much more, you know, just different in so many different ways. You would find just pockets. You know, my husband grew up he's Maori, and he grew up in a community that was a Maori community. Everybody was related in this community, and there was a road down the center. And on one side of the thing were the people who were what they called absolute Maori, which was a kind of an Anglican offshoot, I think, and on the or a Ratana offshoot, maybe that was the church. And on the other side were what my husband, when he was growing up, they referred to the people on the other side as paki paki, which means Kappa, and it was basically a I forget what you call that, like you know, the kind of church where people sing and pray and clap and I forget what you call that. There's a name for that. It's just escaping me.
I don't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that's you know, you can find anything.
Huh. I'm really struck by, you know, these really thick complications. And I am because I think, again, you know, they are not, they do not align or square with the habits in the West of telling history as this kind of linear progressive narrative, right? And I just,
yeah,
I can't thank you enough for helping to kind of tease out some of the things that appear in Lisa's work that might otherwise not be known to us.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting opportunity for me to think about it, to think about where do we get the information, and what is it that we're using, and what are we doing with it? I mean, I know it's a little, I said to a friend of mine, I said, it's a little bit methods and sources, but but still. Oh, well.
So what are you working on now? What is your new project?
Well, as you can tell, this missionary thing is top of mind.
Yes.
But I'm really interested in, I'm trying to write a book about that first generation, the generation that Davide Malo belongs to, the Hawaiian historian, and of people who they're kind of born in the 1790s, who are this transitional generation. They are literate, they travel a lot. A lot of them die because they are exposed to smallpox and to measles and to other things. And so there's a kind of there's this feeling of tragedy about it, because there's this incredible lost potential. It's just heartbreaking, because you have these very adventurous young people who are at a moment of great transformation, who take the opportunity to go and like see, they go to Canton, you know, they go to wherever, and they're like kids from Worcester who decide to go to, you know, Alaska, and you know, they break out, and then, you know, a lot of them die prematurely. But what they do along the way, I think I'm going to try and tell a story of about a handful of them. Who
sounds fantastic.
I hope so. I hope so.
Well, I think we are at 6:45. I think we should wrap up. Are there any other questions in the chat? I don't think so. Then I will thank you very much. I will be in line to buy your next book. Absolutely will be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your research and your erudition and your smarts and your sense of humor, which really makes everything better.
Well, thank you for bringing the Reihana exhibition to Wellesley, which was a stroke of genius. I just want to say.
Thanks.
So as a curator,
thank you.
big thumbs up. Yeah.
Everyone, come and visit. Bring your friends, bring your family.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening, everyone.